A flight attendant slapped a black baby for crying, but when the father stood up, he took control of the entire flight in a way no one expected. He thought silencing a crying child would make him powerful. He didn't realize the man in the next seat had the authority and the skill to take control. Subscribe if you believe cruelty always meets its landing. Sir, control your child. The words cut through the low murmur of the boarding cabin like a switchblade, sharp and sudden. Dr. Damien Cross paused mid-step. The soft weight of his infant son, Eli, pressed gently against his chest in a secure fabric carrier. The hum of jet engines in pre-flight idle echoed faintly outside the windows of Gate 14B, but inside the aircraft, tension had found its first foothold. Damien turned his head slowly, locking eyes with the tall, narrow-faced flight attendant standing just inches from him in the narrow aisle. Trevor Haskin, badge crisp, posture military straight, had a practiced smile etched on his lips, but his eyes were cold and impatient. Damien noticed the faint twitch at the corner of the man's jaw, the way his gloved hand hovered a little too tightly on the backrest of a nearby seat. "He's reacting to the cabin pressure," Damien replied with quiet composure, his voice steady, low. "It should ease once we're at cruising altitude." Trevor didn't nod, didn't blink. He tilted his head forward as if Damien hadn't spoken at all. "Passengers in business class pay for peace," Trevor said, voice lowered as though offering a courtesy, but there was nothing kind in the tone. "Not a soundtrack." A few heads turned. The man in 3A looked up from his newspaper. A young man wearing headphones slid one ear cup off. The tension wasn't loud, but it was palpable, like the faint crackle before a lightning strike. Damien took a slow breath, centering himself. He's not misbehaving. He's an infant, and his ears are adjusting. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone you learn to use in high-pressure environments. He had used it before, back in the Air Force, when every word could mean the difference between life and loss. "I'm managing it." Trevor's expression remained tight, but he took a reluctant half-step back. "Just keep it that way," he muttered, then turned on his heel and marched briskly toward the galley. Damien exhaled. His hand instinctively checked Eli's blanket, adjusting it slightly. The baby's tiny face was scrunched in discomfort, not in tantrum. It was a pained expression, a natural response to changing pressure. Damien pressed his lips gently to Eli's temple and began humming, soft and rhythmic, the way he always did when Eli cried in the car or at home late at night. It usually helped, but the humming wasn't enough to drown out the rising murmur of discontent. A voice from behind grumbled, "Should have stayed in coach if you wanted to bring a crying kid." Another whispered, "Luxury isn't for lullabies." Damien kept his eyes forward, letting the comments roll off his shoulders. It wasn't new. He had endured skepticism and subtle exclusion in boardrooms, summits, and lecture halls. Being a black man holding a baby in a first-class cabin was, apparently, another trigger for some. He returned to his seat, 4C, adjusting his bag beneath his feet. The cabin crew was still securing compartments, cross-checking latches. Overhead, the fasten seatbelt light glowed a soft amber. The engines outside revved up, a deep, vibrating growl. Soon they would lift off. Eli whimpered again, louder this time, the pressure mounting in his tiny ears. Damien gently shifted the bottle from the side pocket, but it hadn't warmed yet. He held it to Eli's lips anyway, hoping the motion might soothe him. Then Trevor reappeared. His footsteps were louder now, purposeful, striking the floor like he owned it. He stopped again at Damien's row, casting a quick glance at the surrounding passengers as if gathering support. The tone he used now was colder, sharpened by resentment. "You need to make him stop," he snapped. Damien looked up calmly. "The bottle's warming." He should settle soon. Trevor leaned down, his breath close. "Do something now, or I will." That line, it didn't just cross a professional boundary. It detonated it. Damien's gaze hardened, but he kept his voice even. He's a baby, not a threat. He's in pain. What you're suggesting is neither safe nor appropriate." The words should have been enough, but they weren't. Trevor's hand twitched at his side, fingers flexing once, then again. A muscle jumped along his neck. Across the aisle, a businessman in a gray vest murmured, "Is this guy serious?" as he reached for his phone. Another passenger angled his screen discreetly, and then it happened. In a motion so quick it seemed almost unreal, Trevor's hand lashed forward and struck Eli across the cheek. The sound was unmistakable. Flesh on flesh, delicate skin meeting unprovoked force. Eli's scream shattered the cabin's hum like glass underfoot. It wasn't just crying anymore. It was a scream of pain and fear, shrill and immediate. The cabin went still. Damien froze. His breath caught in his throat, his mind blank for a fraction of a second. The baby's scream rang in his ears, sharp and piercing. But what came next was deeper, a rising tide of fury, of instinct, of something primal that rose through his spine and burned in his chest. He stood halfway, his knees pressing against the seat in front, his upper body rising with controlled tension. His voice didn't shout. It didn't need to. "You just struck my child." Trevor took a step back, arms lifting in mock defense. "You saw that wrong. He was flailing." A man 2 rows behind stood up. "We all saw it." "Don't lie," someone else added. "I got it on video." Phones were now pointed forward from several seats. Trevor's face paled, but his expression twisted in stubborn defiance. "Sit down," he barked at Damien. "You're escalating this." Damien's voice dropped low, dark, and steady. "You assaulted a baby." The words echoed. Eli's cries continued, now hiccuping between sobs. Damien gently rocked him, eyes never leaving Trevor's. His free hand hovered over the seat back, the other cradling Eli protectively. Across the aisle, the passenger with the phone whispered, "They'll bury this unless someone stands up." Damien already had. The air grew thick with held breath. Somewhere near the front, a flight attendant's voice stammered into a cabin phone. Someone hit the call button. Someone else cursed under their breath. The intercom clicked on, the captain's voice calm and unaware. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened as we navigate a patch of light turbulence." But in row 4C, the storm had already arrived. It was only the beginning of a flight no one would forget. The slap came without warning. A sharp crack tore through the cabin air like a thunderclap, followed by a stunned silence that felt heavier than the pressurized cabin around them. Damien Cross's breath caught in his throat. The world stopped moving for a single, searing moment. Eli had cried before, little whimpers of discomfort, pained squeals during turbulence. But this was different. This was the cry of a baby not just in pain, but in fear. His tiny hands jerked upward, his body stiff with shock as his face turned scarlet. The mark of Trevor Haskins' hand bloomed across his cheek in rising crimson. It was too much, too fast. Damien didn't react at first, not out of weakness but because his mind entered a different mode, the one honed in combat aircraft under pressure, the one trained to suppress panic in favor of precision. His jaw locked, his hands clenched the armrests, his vision narrowed on the man standing over them. Trevor stood motionless, as if realizing too late what he'd done. The expression on his face teetered between rage and regret, though the former clearly held the upper hand. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Not yet. Gasps broke the silence. A passenger 3 rows back stood abruptly, eyes wide. The businessman across the aisle whispered, "Did he just hit the baby?" Damien slowly rose, one hand still supporting Eli, who now sobbed uncontrollably in his arms. The seatbelt sign was still on. The cabin lights dimmed for the early flight, but nothing in this moment followed routine. He stared at Trevor, unblinking. "You struck my child," Damien said quietly, his voice like ice on steel. Trevor's nostrils flared. He was screaming. It was disturbing the cabin. Damien didn't move. His muscles were coiled, his body rigid with the instinct to retaliate. But something deeper held him still. Discipline, training, and the piercing cry of his son. He adjusted Eli against his shoulder, gently rocking him, eyes never leaving the man before him. Another passenger pulled out his phone, hand trembling as he started to record. The lens caught Trevor's face, the red mark on Eli's jaw, and the quiet fury rising behind Damien's eyes. "You need to sit down," Trevor barked, stepping forward. "Now." "Don't take another step," Damien replied. His tone remained calm, but the air around him changed. The atmosphere thickened with a tension that made even nearby passengers lean back instinctively. Trevor scoffed, though the bravado had cracks. "You're being hysterical. This is a controlled environment, and I won't let you turn it into—" "You already did," a voice said from behind. Another male passenger, perhaps in his 50s, stood slowly, arms folded. "You hit a child." "We all saw it." Trevor turned toward the voice, but his words faltered. Damien's mind moved fast, parsing risks. There was no guarantee the captain had been notified. There was no indication that anyone was taking control of the situation. Eli needed medical attention, even if only for observation. And, most of all, this moment needed to be recorded in memory and fact. Truth was going to be buried unless he acted now. "I want to speak to the captain," Damien said, reaching for the overhead call button and pressing it twice. It lit up with a soft ding, but no one came. He pressed it again. Trevor's face darkened. "There's no need to escalate." "You already did," Damien interrupted. His voice lowered an octave, not in volume, but in weight. "And if you think I'm going to let this happen to my son in silence, you don't know who you're dealing with." More passengers had begun filming now. One young man knelt in the aisle, steadying his camera phone with both hands. Another, older gentleman leaned across the aisle to whisper, "You're not alone, sir." We saw everything. Trevor glanced around, realizing the cabin had turned against him. But instead of stepping back, he doubled down. "This will go badly for you," he said, his voice cracking just slightly. "Bringing an infant into business class doesn't make you better than anyone else. It makes you selfish. Some of us pay for peace." Damien inhaled through his nose, letting the insult hang. He looked down at Eli, who had quieted slightly, still sniffling, still shivering, his small cheek warm against his father's chest. "He's not disturbing the cabin," Damien said, loud enough for the front section to hear. "He's reminding it what pain sounds like." Trevor opened his mouth again, but before he could speak, the intercom buzzed overhead. The captain's voice broke in. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently flying at 32,000 feet and expecting light turbulence in the next 15 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The voice faded into ambient noise, unaware of the chaos unfolding below. Trevor smirked. "See?" Business as usual, Damien's eyes remained locked on him. "Not anymore." Somewhere in the back of the plane, another man could be heard saying, "Did you get all of that on video?" The flight continued to hum above the clouds, but something unspoken had shifted forever inside that cabin. The passengers knew it. Damien felt it. Trevor feared it. Eli stirred softly in his father's arms, his breath uneven but slowing. Damien gently kissed the top of his head. Sometimes, Damien thought, even heaven turns its eyes away before justice lands. Trevor's fingers were still trembling from the slap as he took a half-step back, his breath quick and uneven. The air in the cabin had shifted. Something unspoken but heavy gripped the aisle like a storm gathering strength. Damien Cross didn't blink. His eyes remained locked on the flight attendant, burning not with rage, but with the cold precision of a man trained to remain composed under fire. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Step back," he said evenly. Trevor's eyes darted to the cell phones pointed his way. Several passengers were clearly recording now, their devices held just high enough to capture both men in frame. The attendant gave a tight, forced laugh, one that cracked around the edges. "You think anyone will believe you?" Trevor spat, trying to regain control. "You're unstable, bringing a baby into a business-class zone." Damien didn't move, but the words pierced deeper than Trevor realized. They weren't just a cruel jab. They were a reflection of something uglier. A judgment, steeped in assumption, wrapped in entitlement. Around them, murmurs began to swell. A man in a gray blazer across the aisle rose slowly, voice calm but stern. "We all saw what you did." Trevor's facade slipped. "Sit down, or I'll have you detained," he snapped, his hand twitching near his uniform pocket as if he'd suddenly remembered his authority. But his voice cracked mid-sentence. The edge of control he had clung to was fraying fast. Damien's hand hovered near the call button. He pressed it once, then again, and again. "I'd like to speak to the captain," he said aloud, projecting not anger but command. When no one answered, he took a step forward. Trevor instinctively moved to block him. "Don't," Damien warned. Trevor's feet hesitated, frozen by something he couldn't name, perhaps the certainty in Damien's tone, or the silent energy now building behind the rows of passengers. The baby in Damien's arm whimpered again, a broken sound that pierced through the thick tension like a plea. That sound triggered something in Damien. Not rage, but the memory of every moment he had sworn to protect, whether in combat or at home. His body had once carried wounded soldiers through fire. Today, it carried his son. "If you touch me again," Damien said, low and clear, "I'll make sure you're remembered for this." Trevor opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The lights above flickered faintly, and for a moment, it felt like the entire aircraft paused. "Trevor," another male attendant finally said from behind, his voice quieter, trembling. He was younger, maybe early 20s, with freckles across his nose and fear in his eyes. "Trevor, stop. Just stop." But Trevor couldn't. His pride had sealed his path. Cornered by a room of silent witnesses and his own swelling panic, he lurched toward the intercom panel on the wall near the galley. Damien watched the movement, calculated its timing, and moved. In one smooth motion, he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a worn, leather wallet. He flipped it open and raised it into the air, just high enough for the aisle to see the credentials inside glint beneath the overhead lights. "Former Air Force pilot," he announced. "If the captain refuses to intervene, I will." Gasps rippled through the cabin like aftershocks. A man seated near the emergency exit let out a quiet, "Whoa." Another passenger whispered, "That explains the way he's standing." Trevor's face lost all its color. His lips moved, but no words emerged. The intercom crackled once, unused. Passengers looked at one another, then back at Damien. The silence held like a stretched wire until someone broke it. "Let him talk to the captain," a voice called out from row 6. Then another joined in. "Let him through. Give him the mic. Let the man speak." It was no longer just a cabin of travelers. It was a jury, unified not by rage but by recognition. This man wasn't causing chaos. He was standing between it and something worse. Trevor took one step back, then another. The confidence had drained from his posture. Even his shoulders slumped as if the weight of being exposed had finally settled on his spine. He looked around, pleading silently for backup, but found none. Not from the crew, not from the passengers, and not from the voice in his own head. In that charged silence, Damien lowered his hand but didn't step back. His eyes didn't waver. Somewhere behind the cockpit door, the captain would now be hearing the growing chant, the steady demand of 100 voices rising toward authority. And Trevor, still frozen, now knew the truth. At 30,000 feet, justice no longer needed permission to rise. The cockpit door cracked open with a sharp metallic click, and the cabin fell into a sudden hush. First Officer Riley Denmar stepped halfway out, his face pale, his eyes darting across the tense rows of passengers. The pressure inside the plane wasn't just from the altitude anymore. It was hanging in the air like a second atmosphere, brittle and ready to snap. "What's happening back here?" Riley asked, his voice low but edged with concern. Trevor Haskins spun around quickly, attempting to retake control. "Unruly passenger. Violent behavior," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Damien. "He's creating a safety risk for the cabin." But Riley's gaze didn't land on Damien. It moved past him to the small child trembling in his arms, cheeks streaked with drying tears, his tiny body clinging to his father's chest like a life preserver in a storm. Then Riley's eyes landed on the cluster of phones held high in recording hands, all pointed squarely at Trevor. The flicker of confusion in his eyes hardened into something else. Damien stepped forward, not aggressively, just deliberately. His voice was level, quiet, but it carried like a bell through the cabin. "He hit my child." The silence was complete. Even the subtle hum of the engine seemed to fade beneath the weight of those 5 words. Riley didn't respond immediately. He didn't have to. His body gave a small jolt, his jaw twitching as the gravity of the accusation settled onto him. Trevor laughed once, a short, bitter sound. "He provoked me," he said quickly. He was shouting, threatening the crew. Riley turned slowly to face him, and for a second nothing was said, but his eyes no longer wavered. "Did you hit the baby, Trevor?" Trevor hesitated too long. It was just a tap. He was screaming. A chorus of passengers cut him off with disgusted murmurs. One man in the middle row stood halfway up and said, loud enough for all to hear, "We saw you." Every single one of us, Riley looked back at Damien. The lines around his mouth deepened. He gave a single nod. "Captain wants to talk to you." Damien blinked. "Me?" Riley leaned in and lowered his voice. "He saw some of the footage. He needs to understand what's happening." Then he turned and unlatched the cockpit door fully. Trevor's voice rose in protest. "He can't enter the cockpit. He's not crew." But Riley didn't even look back. "He's not the one who hit a baby." The door opened wider. Damien shifted Eli gently in his arms and followed, passing rows of stunned passengers. The murmurs behind him sounded like a rising tide, but he focused only on the threshold ahead. The cockpit was tight and dimly lit, filled with screens, dials, and the steady blinking of status indicators. The air smelled faintly of metal and recycled air. Captain Lorik Brandt sat in the left seat, his silver hair neat beneath his headset, his hands resting calmly on the control panel. His presence filled the space, not with volume, but with something heavier. Experience. He looked up as Damien stepped in. "Close the door," Brandt said quietly. Riley did so, sealing them in. Damien adjusted Eli against his chest and took a measured breath. "I appreciate you giving me a moment." Brandt motioned to the co-pilot's jump seat. "Talk." Damien remained standing. His voice shifted into clipped, practiced cadence, the kind he'd used in briefing rooms, not nurseries. "I'm Dr. Damien Cross, former USAF. That flight attendant struck my son, unprovoked after threatening him twice. Passengers filmed it. I requested intervention." He escalated instead. Brandt studied him, silent. His eyes weren't blank. They were working, measuring, calculating. Finally, he shifted slightly in his seat, glancing toward the small view window set into the cockpit door. Through it, Trevor's face appeared momentarily, eyes darting. "I can't turn this plane around without clearance," Brandt muttered. "Protocol would take hours." Damien nodded once. "But you can divert." Brandt tapped a few buttons, checking coordinates. "Maybe. Depends how much fuel we burn." Then his voice softened, not with sympathy, but curiosity. "You still know your way around a Solaire 300? Damien let out a breath, half laughing under it. I trained on its prototype back in '09. Brant looked at him directly now, weighing the risk, the stakes. His fingers hovered above the comm system, then withdrew. I could get stripped of my wings for this, he said quietly. Outside the cockpit, Trevor's muffled voice rose again. He doesn't have clearance. He's not authorized. Brant's eyes didn't blink. He turned slowly toward the door, then back at Damien. Neither, he said firmly, was what you did. The moment hung suspended like a held breath, like the plane itself. When power crosses the line, authority shifts to conscience. Trevor's fists pounded against the cockpit door like thunder, 3 times, then again, louder. You can't just lock me out. Do you know who I am? He screamed, voice cracking with rage. His threats bounced uselessly off the reinforced composite. Inside the cockpit, the only sounds were the steady beep of instruments and the low hum of altitude adjustments as Dr. Damien Cross's hands guided the yoke. Captain Lorik Brant, his expression unreadable, leaned forward to monitor the altitude indicators. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the control panel, giving the confined space the feel of a command center mid-crisis. He didn't look up. Level her out to 330. Winds are pushing harder on the left wing. Damien didn't speak. His right hand corrected the pitch by instinct while his left cradled his sleeping son. Eli's breath was soft now, a faint rhythm against his father's chest, no longer screaming, just faint whimpers between breaths. Damien felt every one of them like a needle under the skin. He didn't dare shift, afraid even gravity would feel too cruel in that moment. Brant cleared his throat and keyed in a set of emergency override codes. Falcon Ridge Airfield's the nearest with an emergency crew. It's not standard protocol to divert for incidents like this, but this isn't standard. He paused, finally glancing sideways. You good to help bring her in? Yes, sir, Damien replied quietly, eyes focused. His voice held no anger, just the kind of steady resolve that used to guide wounded soldiers through medevac extractions under enemy fire. He adjusted the rudder trim and began scanning atmospheric data. Turbulence along the descending corridor. We'll need to re-angle the approach vector, or we'll jar the rear cabin. Do it, Brant said. You've got the stick. Outside the narrow cockpit windows, the sky stretched pale blue and endless. Wisps of high-altitude clouds curled like restless fingers. But inside the cabin, the air was thick with pressure. Trevor's muffled shouting had shifted from arrogance to desperation. Career destruction! You'll all be out of jobs. In the rear of the plane, passengers gripped their armrests. Some whispered prayers, others watched in stunned silence. Near the galley, Peter Lane, the youngest of the crew, moved quietly down the aisle, his voice low and calm as he comforted an elderly man clutching a rosary. He leaned toward a worried father and whispered, "We're with the man. With the father. Don't worry." Back in the cockpit, the control panel flickered once, a soft warning about the change in barometric pressure. Damien adjusted for the crosswind. His hand never trembled. Descent rate needs to slow by 2%. Any faster, and we risk a lateral roll on touchdown. Brant nodded. You still remember the Solaire 300 systems that well? I flew the prototype, Damien replied, his eyes never leaving the instruments. It's in my bones. The aircraft responded to his command like a creature recognizing a former master. The engines softened their growl. The glide path began its slow, smooth descent through the clouds. Then came the radio transmission. Falcon Ridge, this is Silvercrest 714, requesting emergency diversion, code Silver. We have a civilian emergency aboard. Confirm runway status A Crackle. Then, Silvercrest 714, this is Falcon Ridge. Runway 2R cleared. Emergency vehicles standing by Brant turned slightly in his seat. That's us. Towers ready, Damien's jaw tightened. He shifted his son gently, supporting Eli's head with the curve of his forearm. He could still see the faint, discolored imprint across the baby's cheek. The memory of the slap, its sound, its cruelty, flickered like static behind his eyes. His voice dropped to a low murmur. No one should ever hit a child under my watch, air or ground. The cockpit lights flickered then, once, sharply. A coincidence, perhaps, or something else. It passed as quickly as it came. Outside, Falcon Ridge came into view below, bathed in the golden haze of approaching dusk. Emergency lights pulsed along the runway in careful cadence, like a heartbeat echoing upward into the sky. It wasn't turbulence that shook the sky that day. It was justice, finally taking control. The landing gear groaned as it lowered into place, the mechanical sound cutting through the thick tension like a blade. The aircraft dipped beneath the heavy cloud cover, its wings shuddering slightly in the pockets of wind. Inside the cabin, no one moved. The silence was almost sacred, every breath shallow, every eye fixed on the cockpit door like it was the entrance to salvation or doom. Trevor paced near the rear galley, his steps quick, erratic. His polished shoes scuffed lightly against the metal floor as he muttered to himself, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that several passengers still had their phones raised, cameras rolling. His eyes darted back and forth, but he avoided Damien's seat entirely. The baby's cries had long subsided, replaced now by the occasional sleepy sigh against Damien's shoulder. Eli's tiny fingers clung to his father's collar, his bruised jaw pressing gently against Damien's chest. The plane dipped again, smoother now. Then, with a jolt, the wheels touched the runway, soft, deliberate, and without hesitation. The cabin exploded with applause, a brief emotional release after so much fear. But Damien didn't flinch. His eyes remained forward, his hand steady on the back of the co-pilot's chair, guiding as if the act of landing was more than physics, it was principle. Captain Brandt eased the jet to a halt, his fingers dancing across the instrument panel with veteran calm. Outside, the fog lit up in bursts of red and blue. Sirens wailed from every direction, urgent but coordinated. Emergency vehicles clustered on the tarmac like sentinels waiting for battle orders. Inside, that sacred silence returned. Faster, colder this time. Everyone waited. No one knew what would happen next. Trevor took that silence as an opening. "He hijacked the plane!" he shouted, bolting down the aisle. His face was flushed, his voice sharp with desperation rather than certainty. "He forced his way in. He's not a pilot. The cockpit door swung open. Captain Brandt stepped out slowly, his uniform still immaculate, his posture exact. But his eyes, cold, focused, were fixed on Trevor like a blade on a whetstone. He pointed one steady hand toward Damien, who remained in the doorway, holding Eli gently, protectively. "That man," the captain said, his voice like the crack of thunder, "saved this aircraft." Gasps broke through the tension. Passengers turned to one another, murmuring, some nodding in silent agreement. Trevor's mouth opened again, but before he could speak, a voice shouted from the front. "Everyone remain seated." Damien didn't answer immediately. He adjusted Eli in his arms, the baby still curled into his chest, small fingers gripping his father's collar. Then he reached into his coat and produced his identification. "Dr. Damien Cross," he said quietly, his voice low but resolute. "Biomedical engineer." Former USAF pilot Hayes glanced down at the credentials, then up again, his expression subtly shifting. "That explains the landing." Behind them, the cabin had begun to thaw. The atmosphere shifted from fear to fragile relief. Passengers rose from their seats, some dazed, others still processing what they had witnessed. A man in a tweed blazer approached Damien slowly, his steps unsure. He was older, white-haired, with eyes that carried years of regret. "You did what a real father does," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "You protected." Damien nodded slightly, unable to find words. There was a tightness in his chest, not just from the adrenaline fading, but from the weight of what had happened, from what still might. Outside the aircraft, Trevor's muffled voice could still be heard. "I'll sue the airline," he barked. "You'll all regret this." The irony struck like a distant thunderclap. Damien turned slightly toward the window. Beyond the tarmac, the reflective surface of the terminal glass mirrored the scene. Emergency crews still on standby, investigators, press vans rolling in. In the corner of that reflection, the Silvercrest Air logo gleamed, untouched, pristine, untouched by the bruise now forming on Eli's soft jaw. A paramedic approached gently, carrying a compact trauma kit. "Sir," he said, pausing as if asking for permission to examine the child. Damien allowed it, stepping aside so the man could gently inspect Eli's face. The baby whimpered slightly, but remained tucked against his father's heartbeat. The medic's eyes flicked up after a few seconds. "He's stable. But there's some tenderness. It's a good thing you acted when you did." Hayes stood beside them, arms folded. "They'll try to bury this," he said plainly. "Sweep it under the rug. Probably pay you off, throw some jargon into a report, label it resolved." Damien turned to him, his eyes darker now, the calm in his posture replaced by something more anchored, resolve. "Then we won't let them," Damien said. "We'll push higher than silence can reach." Hayes gave the faintest nod of approval. More passengers approached Damien. Some offered thanks, others apologies for having stayed seated while he stood up alone. Damien didn't hold it against them. He knew fear could paralyze, especially at 30,000 feet. What mattered now was momentum, that the story wouldn't end on a tarmac surrounded by flashing lights. Outside the cabin, the flash of news cameras intensified. Reporters, barely held back by airport security, pressed forward against barriers, their microphones raised like weapons. Damien didn't flinch. He stood tall. Eli held close. He wasn't a man seeking fame. He was a man who had drawn a line mid-air and meant to hold it all the way down. Inside, the cabin doors were finally opened. A gust of evening wind slipped through, rippling Damien's shirt and catching the edge of his hospital bracelet from Eli's brief checkup. Hayes turned to his team, issuing quiet instructions, his voice crisp. "Secure all video evidence. Interview every witness. I want this airtight." Damien watched him for a moment, then looked back at the aircraft that had, just hours ago, been an ordinary flight. Now it was a crime scene, a headline, a symbol. He didn't ask for this, but now that it had begun, he would see it through. Outside, the press lights bathed the tarmac in electric white. A single flash caught Damien mid-step, Eli's face partially shielded, his own expression etched with the calm that comes before a storm. The fight hadn't ended on the runway. It had only found its voice. By evening, the footage had ignited every screen across the country. The slap, caught from 3 different angles by passengers, was everywhere. It played on news broadcasts, filled the top 10 trending videos online, and looped on social media with captions like #JusticeForEli and #SkylineShame. Networks blurred the infant's face but left Trevor's clearly visible, his hand mid-swing, frozen in the frame that would haunt Silvercrest Air's reputation forever. Outside the children's ward at Easton Valley Medical Center, camera crews clustered like birds before a storm. Hospital security struggled to keep them behind barricades. Inside, in a softly lit room insulated from the chaos, Damien sat in a hard plastic chair beside the small hospital bed where Eli lay resting. Monitors beeped softly. 2 uniformed air marshals boarded through the forward hatch, stepping onto the plane with swift, practiced movements. Their presence shifted the room's weight instantly. The lead marshal, a broad-chested man with sharp eyes and a radio crackling at his side, walked straight down the aisle. He held up a hand to calm the murmuring passengers and said firmly, "We need full cooperation." "Stay in your seats until instructed," Trevor rushed toward them. "You have to arrest him," he shouted, jabbing a finger toward Damien. "He overpowered the crew, threatened us, manipulated the captain." But the marshal didn't answer. He simply looked to the passenger seated in 7C, an elderly man who had quietly filmed the entire event. The man raised his phone without a word and handed it over. "Play it," the marshal instructed. The video filled the cabin with sound. The slap was unmistakable. A sharp crack, followed by the sudden, heart-wrenching cry of a baby. The footage caught Trevor's hand recoiling, his face twisted in frustration. Then came Damien's restrained response, the panic of the cabin, the chaos as Trevor tried to twist the truth. Every phone in the area buzzed as other passengers replayed their own footage. The cabin transformed into a courtroom, and the verdict was unanimous. Trevor's knees buckled slightly. "That's taken out of context," he began, but the marshal cut him off. "Put your hands where I can see them." Trevor hesitated, looking around wildly. But there was no support here, no one to defend him, no shield of authority left to hide behind. Slowly, he raised his hands, and the second marshal stepped forward, locking the cuffs around his wrists with a final, echoing click. As they began to escort him off the plane, his voice shrieked in protest. "I was the one in charge. You're making a mistake. He's dangerous, not me." But the marshal never turned. "We've seen enough." Trevor's cries faded as he was led down the stairs into the flashing chaos outside. Behind him, a hush reclaimed the plane. Passengers exhaled deeply as if only now realizing they had been holding their breath since the clouds parted. In the cockpit, Damien handed over the final flight data to Captain Brandt, who nodded in approval. "Smooth under pressure," Brandt said, "like a real pilot." Damien didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his son, peaceful now, though the faint discoloration on his cheek remained. "Just doing what any father would," he said softly. Captain Brandt placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not every father could have landed this bird." Damien offered a small nod, then stepped back into the cabin as the engines wound down completely. Sirens outside dimmed, replaced by the faint whirring of portable generators and the static chatter of radios. One by one, passengers turned to Damien, not with fear or pity, but with respect. Some nodded, one clapped, and others joined. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It was acknowledgement. As Damien sat down, Eli still curled against his chest, the final weight of the flight settled. It hadn't just been a diversion, it had been a shift. Something permanent had cracked open. And Trevor? His name was already being whispered across news apps, message threads, and live stream captions. But the real story was playing out in the stillness of that dim cabin, where the truth had landed first. The sound of a slap had become the sound of an empire collapsing. Trevor Haskins stumbled as two uniformed air marshals gripped his arms, his wrists already locked in tight cuffs. His voice cracked from shouting, yet no one in the cabin flinched. Phones remained raised, their red recording dots silently absorbing every frame, every scream, every ounce of indignation the disgraced flight attendant tried to spit out. "I was doing my job," Trevor shouted, twisting toward the rows of passengers who refused to meet his gaze. "He hijacked the plane. He endangered everyone." But the faces staring back weren't buying it. They were grim, stone-like, unified in quiet condemnation. The only sounds were the low rumble of cooling engines and the rhythmic clicks of camera shutters. Commander Hayes stepped onto the aircraft with a steady gait. His dark suit bore the crest of the Aviation Security Division, and the hard-set lines of his face suggested years of protocol, of order, of experience in restoring calm after chaos. He approached Damien Cross with the kind of respect reserved for men who had done something extraordinary but hadn't asked to. "Sir," Hayes said, nodding, "I've reviewed the footage." His voice was even, professional, but there was a faint undercurrent of something else, gratitude, maybe awe. "You maintained control and kept everyone safe. I need your statement." A bruise, faint but visible, darkened one side of the baby's jaw. Though the doctors had assured him there was no permanent damage, Eli's soft whimpers and occasional startle in sleep pierced deeper than any diagnosis. Damien didn't speak. He just held his son close and listened to every shallow breath. When a nurse entered and gently asked if he needed anything, he only shook his head. The woman looked at him for a long moment, then whispered, "For what it's worth. The whole floor's with you." She left a folded blanket on the chair arm and quietly exited. Damien didn't touch the blanket. He only kept replaying the moment over and over, the impact, the stunned silence, the weight of every gaze. His phone buzzed, dozens of unread messages, unknown numbers, journalists, politicians, activists, all wanting a word, a quote, a headline. He ignored them all, until one message cut through the noise. "You've flown too high." Land quietly. It came from an unlisted number, no signature. He stared at it, thumb hovering over the screen. A veiled threat. Not surprising, but it made something click into place. He turned to Eli, who stirred slightly against his chest. "If they built their power in silence," he murmured, voice low but steady, "we'll dismantle it with truth." The next morning, Damien stood behind a podium hastily assembled outside the hospital. He wore the same jacket from the flight, his shirt wrinkled from a sleepless night. Camera lights flared to life. Microphones extended forward like curious hands. He didn't blink. "I am not here for revenge," he said clearly, "but for reform. My son deserves skies free of cruelty disguised as authority." The words carried like a clean wind. The reporters froze. The tone, not angry, not theatrical, just precise, measured. It struck harder than any yell could have. Some lowered their cameras as if out of respect. "Many of you have asked me what I want," he continued. "I want passengers to fly without fear. I want accountability that doesn't hide behind uniforms. And I want those who think power is a license for cruelty to meet something stronger. Conscience." By afternoon, his words had become the center of every headline. "Father of slapped infant breaks silence," scrolled across news tickers. Not revenge, but reform, became a rallying cry. But what happened next surprised even Damien. His legal team, led by civil rights attorney Malcolm Varon, began receiving anonymous tips, messages from former and current Silvercrest Air employees. The first was from a pilot who wrote, "I've seen him snap before." Management always covered it. Then a baggage supervisor who emailed, "Trevor was protected." Always. "Ask about Flight 229 last March." Others followed. A young flight attendant named Jonah left a voicemail, voice shaking. "There's a pattern. They bury complaints. I'll testify if needed, but please protect my name." The picture became clearer. Trevor Haskin wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom, but not everyone welcomed the uprising. That evening, Damien's inbox received a second message, short, deliberate. "You're dragging names that know how to bury deeper." Malcolm read it aloud and frowned. "They're trying to rattle you," he said, placing the phone back on the table. "Which means you're rattling them first." Damien remained silent for a moment, then stood by the window of the hospital lounge. Outside, the sky was a clean blue, streaked with the contrails of departing jets. "We're not here to shout into wind," he said quietly. "We're here to change its direction." Reporters gathered again that night, but Damien refused interviews. He stayed beside Eli, who had finally begun sleeping without stirring. The machines beside his bed blinked softly, like stars in miniature. Damien kept his hand on his son's back, steady and warm. In a conference room downtown, Silvercrest executives met behind closed doors, their faces pale, their words hushed. One muttered, "If this goes to court, we're finished." Another suggested a settlement. The CEO slammed a palm on the table. "No payouts. We label it isolated misconduct." One bad actor. The decision was made. A press release followed. "Silvercrest Air deeply regrets the isolated misconduct aboard Flight 417. We are cooperating with investigations and will ensure accountability through internal review. The public saw through it instantly. Screens lit up with reactions. One anchor asked, "Why call it isolated when the silence is company policy?" A protest formed outside Silvercrest's headquarters before sunset. Cardboard signs read, "Truth needs wings. Ground Trevor, not justice," and simply, "Eli." But inside the hospital room, Damien sat still. He read a short board book to his son, turning each page slowly, even as his phone vibrated nonstop in his pocket. Eli stirred and let out a soft sound, not a cry, but a tiny sigh. Damien looked down, brushed a hand over his head, and smiled faintly. Every storm begins with one tear no one forgets. He lashed out at the innocent, calling it discipline, while the cabin froze in disbelief. If you believe silence in the face of wrongdoing is consent, hit subscribe now. Because justice doesn't wait, it acts. The leak hit the news feeds like a rupture, sudden, explosive, and impossible to ignore. Silvercrest Air's internal investigation, meant to remain sealed, had surfaced online, exposing what many feared but few could prove. Screens across the country flickered with documents showing a damning pattern: buried passenger complaints, redacted incident reports, and disciplinary files marked "dismissed" without action. At the center of it all, Trevor Haskins' name appeared 5 times, each followed by phrases like passenger exaggeration, insufficient evidence, or witness withdrawn. The mask of isolated misconduct was shredded. This wasn't an accident. It was a culture. Damien Cross read the leaked file in silence from his office, the soft sound of Eli's breathing monitor clicking steadily beside him. The infant lay curled in a sleep pod, a warm blanket draped over his side. The bruise had faded, but the weight in Damien's chest had not. He stared at the words on the screen, lips tightening. "They knew," he whispered, "and they did nothing." His attorney, Malcolm Varon, paced nearby, eyes flicking between printouts and his tablet. A former aviation prosecutor with a sharp mind and a sharper sense of timing, Malcolm stopped suddenly and jabbed a page with his finger. "We can sue," he said. "Class action, civil, federal, whatever route you want. We don't just have evidence, we have precedent, and you have leverage. Use it." Damien turned toward him, his voice steady but quiet. "And what happens when they bury it again? Settle quietly? Replace one executive with another? Pay off a few families and call it solved?" He stood, the room dim around him save for the desk lamp. "I don't want compensation. I want prevention." He crossed the room and pulled a folder from the drawer. Inside was a draft, a federal petition calling for the creation of an independent in-flight ethics board. No oversight by the airline. No diluted internal panels. Just a civilian review board with the power to investigate, suspend, and overhaul in real time. Damien placed it on the table and looked up. "I'm filing this." Malcolm blinked, then slowly nodded. "That'll rattle every carrier in the country. You sure you're ready for the blowback?" Damien didn't hesitate. "They already hit my son." The petition gained traction faster than expected. Within 72 hours, the proposal surged across social media, amplified by journalists, passengers, and flight staff alike. Former employees of Silvercrest began to speak out, anonymous at first, then public. One was a gate supervisor, another a retired flight engineer. Their stories matched. The silence wasn't new, it was policy. But not all consequences favored Damien's side. The airline, desperate to shift narrative weight, announced the suspension of Captain Lorik Brandt and First Officer Riley Denmar. The reason, violation of cockpit protocol for allowing an unqualified civilian to assist in flight. The decision triggered backlash so swift that protesters camped outside Silvercrest headquarters before sunrise. Signs read, "They protected us," and "Accountability starts at the top." Still, the airline held its ground for now. Damien received the news while on a video call with Malcolm. "They're punishing the men who stopped the situation from becoming a disaster," Malcolm said bitterly, dragging a hand down his face. "Classic deflection." "They're scared," Damien replied, "scared enough to isolate the ones who did the right thing." He stood and walked to the window. The city glowed below, alive with motion, yet he felt the weight of stillness pressing down on him. He opened a secure folder on his desk and pulled out the flight data, the telemetry recordings, the cabin logs, and the manual override records showing his restabilization inputs during turbulence. The proof wasn't just moral. It was mechanical. "Let's give them something harder to deflect," Damien said. A week later, the documents were made public. The backlash tripled. News commentators who once hesitated now called the cockpit suspension a betrayal. Even veteran pilots weighed in, praising Brandt and Denmar's decision as the only logical choice given the escalating danger. That's when the government stepped in. Congressional hearings were called to investigate in-flight protocol violations and passenger safety policies. Damien was summoned to testify. On the day of the hearing, the Capitol buzzed with energy. Damien walked through the marbled halls, Eli cradled against his chest, tucked beneath a soft gray blanket. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions, flashes bursting like fireworks. But Damien didn't flinch. His jaw was set, eyes calm, presence unmistakably composed. Inside the committee room, the atmosphere shifted to reverence as he entered. Lawmakers sat straight, folders open, pens poised. Damien stood alone before the panel, placed a hand on the small of Eli's back, and began. "My name is Dr. Damien Cross," he said, voice even. "I am a biomedical engineer and a former United States Air Force pilot. On a commercial flight 2 weeks ago, my infant son was assaulted by a crew member, and the chain of command failed to intervene. When escalation followed, I was left with a decision: do nothing and risk panic, or step in." He paused, looking at the lawmakers with unwavering eyes. "This isn't about a slap. This is about silence. This is about the systems that protect institutions instead of people. This is about every complaint ignored, every passenger intimidated, every child endangered by power without accountability." A rustle passed through the room, but Damien didn't stop. "I'm not here for headlines. I'm here for the next flight, for the father who boards a plane believing the sky is safer than the ground, for the mother who can't leave a bruise behind, for the child who doesn't understand why they were hurt. I'm asking this committee to do what the airlines won't: protect us. Not after the fact, but before." He glanced down at Eli, still sleeping softly in his arms. "The safest sky," he said gently, "is one where decency flies first." A hush fell over the room like a closing curtain. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the pens paused. For a long moment it felt like the air itself was waiting. "Sometimes," Damien added quietly, "calm is louder than thunder." The moment the edited footage hit the internet, the damage was immediate. News anchors debated heatedly, influencers backpedaled, and hashtags that once championed Damien Cross began to vanish beneath clouds of doubt. In the warped video, Damien looked aggressive, rising too fast, voice sharpened, posture rigid. The slap itself had been cut short, the context erased, replaced by a narrative that served only one interest: Silver Crest Air. In a quiet office lit only by the soft blue glow of a desk lamp, Damien sat watching the broadcast on a tablet, his face unreadable. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by Eli's gentle breathing as he napped in a crib beside the desk. Damien's jaw tightened, eyes narrowing on the screen. He didn't slam the tablet down. He didn't shout. He simply reached for his phone and dialed a number he'd hoped not to use. "Malcolm," he said when his legal advisor picked up. They moved first. Malcolm Varen's voice was calm but weary. "We expected this." They're trying to rewrite the story before the public forgets the truth." "And the committee?" Damien asked, wavering. Some members have already expressed concern about the footage. "They won't waver long," Damien said, his voice low, steady. "Not after what's coming." He didn't explain further, even though Malcolm didn't press, because Damien had already received the encrypted message that morning, a file marked Solaire 300 CVR. It came from an anonymous sender, but the audio file was signed with a name embedded in the metadata: Brandt. Damien played the recording again, this time through his noise-canceling headphones. The hiss of radio static was soon overtaken by Trevor's voice, coarse, angry, unmistakable. "I don't care what he used to be." "These people think the rules don't apply to them," Trevor had said. Then came the second voice, Captain Lorik Brandt's, measured but firm. "He's a father with a crying child. Your behavior is out of line, Trevor." And then it was clear. The slur, spoken low but recorded clearly. Damien removed the headphones slowly. His breath came out in a long, tired exhale. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt the burden grow heavier. He knew what releasing this would do, not just to Trevor, but to the airline, to the crew who had remained silent, and to the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. He stared at Eli, who shifted gently in his sleep, one tiny hand curled near his cheek. That was the reason. Not revenge, not glory. Protection. The full cockpit audio went public the next morning. The reaction was instantaneous. Silvercrest Air's stock plummeted. Protesters gathered outside its headquarters carrying signs with phrases like, "He protected, you punished," and "Silence is violence" at 30,000 feet. For the first time in weeks, the public had clarity and rage. Captain Brandt, who had quietly stepped down after the incident, emerged from retirement to give a televised interview. His words were simple but echoed across every major network. "We broke protocol because conscience demanded it, and I recorded the cockpit because I feared they'd bury the truth. Damien Cross didn't threaten safety, he preserved it." By that afternoon, Congress issued a subpoena for Silvercrest executives. Investigations widened. The airline tried to deflect, issuing shallow apologies and placing Trevor on permanent leave. But the damage was done. And Damien? He didn't celebrate. He sat at the head of a long conference table at the new headquarters of the Eli Foundation, a nonprofit born not from ambition, but necessity. The logo, a silver feather resting on a child's footprint, adorned the wall behind him. Around the table sat men from all walks of life: pilots, engineers, advocates, doctors, all of them fathers. "We don't need revenge," Damien told them during their first official meeting. "We need change." Their first program launched weeks later, an airline certification for child-centered flight crew training, including trauma-informed care and racial bias awareness. Airlines were reluctant at first, but pressure from passengers, regulators, and public media forced them to adopt the guidelines. They called it the Cross Standard. At home, Eli was thriving. He giggled when Damien read aloud from flight manuals, flipping pages as if they were bedtime fairy tales. One evening, as the toddler curled in his lap with a toy plane in hand, Damien kissed the top of his head and whispered, "You'll fly someday, son. And the sky will be kinder because of you." His phone buzzed on the table. A message from Brandt. "You taught me that silence kills more than turbulence." Damien smiled quietly, typing no reply, only locking the screen and holding his son closer. The storm had tried to erase them, but the winds had shifted. That day, the man they tried to silence became the voice the sky would never forget. Months passed, but the echoes of that slap still haunted the quiet corners of Damien Cross's mind. The footage hadn't just gone viral, it had fractured a silence that had protected cruelty for too long. Now, the walls of Silvercrest Air were cracking. News anchors on every major network cut into programming to cover a breaking press conference. The airline's corporate board had been dismantled, and the CEO, once untouchable, had resigned. His replacement, a pale, nervous executive named Jordan Kess, stood behind a podium, gripping the edges like a man clinging to a lifeboat. "We failed in our duty of care," he said, voice trembling as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. The air around him felt thin, suffocating under the weight of national expectation. His statement echoed across television sets and phones around the country. But Damien wasn't watching. He sat on the living room floor of his modest home, cradling Eli in his arms. The little boy had finally drifted into sleep after a restless afternoon, whimpering at the sound of any passing siren or loud voice on TV. Damien rocked him gently, a bottle resting beside them, untouched. The apology might have satisfied the headlines, but it hadn't reached the wound that lived behind his son's eyes. Closure wasn't something that came from a press release. It came from change, from laws, from justice that could be measured. A soft knock sounded at the front door. Damien rose carefully, still holding Eli, and opened it to find Malcolm Varon standing there with a file tucked beneath his arm. His legal advisor was a calm presence, his usual sharp suit a little rumpled from long days and even longer nights. "It's official," Malcolm said, holding up the folder. "The Passenger Dignity Act just passed through Congress. Signed this morning." Damien blinked. "They actually did it." "They did," Malcolm said with a faint smile. "Unanimously. Mandates recording devices in all aircraft cabins. Any in-flight assault allegation means immediate crew suspension, pending investigation." A heavy silence fell between them. Damien let the news settle in, then stepped back and motioned Malcolm inside. As the door closed, he spoke softly. "They should have done it years ago." Malcolm nodded. "But they didn't have you." "Now they do." Despite the legislative victory, the nights were not peaceful. Damien found himself waking in cold sweat, the sound of that slap ringing in his ears like a gunshot. He would rush to Eli's crib only to find the boy sleeping, safe, but a part of him still braced for danger. Even the smallest noises, a dish clattering, a phone vibrating too loudly, caused Eli to flinch and cry, his tiny hands rising to shield his face as if expecting the worst. Damien brought him to a trauma therapist named Dr. Ezra Mearns, a quiet man who watched Eli play with building blocks before gently saying, "He remembers. Not in words, but in the body. That kind of fear doesn't go away easily, but it can be healed." That night, Damien stood alone at the Foundation headquarters. The building was quiet, bathed in soft amber light from the emergency exit signs and motionless screens. He wandered into the main office where a wall displayed hundreds of handwritten letters from travelers. Each one a story, a thank you, a cry for help. Some were from parents whose children had been treated poorly on flights. Others came from crew members who had been afraid to speak up until now. He read them slowly, absorbing every word like they were wounds being handed to him, trusting he would not let them bleed unseen. A letter caught his eye. It was written in blue ink on wrinkled, lined paper. "My son has autism." A flight attendant once threatened to sedate him. "I never knew how to fight back." "You did. Thank you." Damien's fingers trembled as he folded the paper, placing it gently back in its slot. The air inside the office felt different now, heavier but not with sorrow, with responsibility. He walked to the front window, looking out at the street below where traffic lights blinked in slow rhythm and distant sirens sang faintly in the night. Behind him, the quiet hum of servers and network routers reminded him that change wasn't just an idea, it had infrastructure now. Volunteers filled these rooms during the day, answering messages, coordinating support, translating letters into legal complaints, mapping reforms. Damien placed his palm against the glass and whispered to the night, "No other father should have to carry this." The past still visited him, but now it came with purpose. And though pain lingered in every corner of memory, so did resolve. He had not screamed. He had not fought back with fists or rage. He had flown through the worst kind of storm with nothing but composure and truth, and now the world was beginning to follow his lead. As he turned back toward the letters, lit softly like sacred artifacts in a museum of quiet strength, he let himself breathe deeply for the first time in days. His face was calm, eyes focused. "Maybe justice," he whispered, "doesn't roar, it endures." The video hit the news feeds like a storm front. Grainy but undeniable, it showed a uniformed airline employee yelling at a seated male passenger inches from his face. The passenger, middle-aged, quiet, held his ticket in trembling fingers as the attendant berated him about a seat change error. "I said back to row 22, not here," the attendant barked, jabbing a finger at his chest. The man didn't argue. He simply sat still, his lips pressed together, glancing at the phone someone across the aisle had aimed in his direction. Within hours, the clip had gone viral. By morning, Damian Cross's name was trending again, not for what he'd done, but for what he now represented. A sharp knock on the door came just after sunrise. Damian had barely finished buckling Eli into his booster seat for breakfast. Malcolm Varon, his legal advisor and longtime friend, entered holding his tablet. "They're already outside," Malcolm said grimly, nodding toward the street. Through the window, a small crowd of reporters had gathered at the gate. Some held microphones, others live-streamed on their phones. Satellite vans idled along the curb. The same frenzy Damian had once avoided now came racing back with expectation, not sympathy. "They want a statement," Malcolm said. "Some already saying you should denounce the airline again." "They're expecting fire." Damian looked down at Eli, who was now humming to himself, spooning oatmeal in slow, distracted motions. "I'm not here to burn things down," Damian replied quietly. "I'm here to build what should have already been standing." An hour later, he stepped out onto the front porch. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters called his name. The morning wind tugged at his blazer, and the sky overhead, broad and pale, mirrored his expression. "I've seen the footage," Damian began, "and like many of you, I was angry." A few murmurs passed through the crowd, pens clicking, cameras adjusting. "But I won't respond with rage," he continued, "because we must build systems that outlive outrage." The sentence landed like a weight dropped in still water. Reporters paused. Microphones lowered slightly. Even the wind seemed to hush. Damian's voice was steady, not defiant, but resolute. Not just a victim recounting pain, but a father, a builder, a man who had turned a wound into architecture. Inside, Eli watched from the window, nose pressed to the glass. His toy plane, one of many scattered around the house, rested in his lap. Later that evening, Damian returned inside. The tension from the morning had ebbed, replaced by a quiet calm. He stepped onto the porch again just as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the yard in amber light. The sky, clear now, stretched endlessly overhead. Eli toddled out, barefoot, clutching a tiny silver model of a passenger jet. He reached out with his hand, fingers spread, pointing upward. "Plane, Papa," he murmured. Damian's heart gave a slow, quiet thud. He knelt beside his son, placing a hand gently over the child's back, feeling the warmth of life and possibility. "That's right, son," he said, his voice soft and full. "But remember, no one owns the sky." Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message. He pulled it out and saw the name. Captain Lorik Brandt. He opened it. A single line read, "The new fleet launches tomorrow. Each one carries your Foundation's emblem near the cockpit door." Damian stared at the words, the glow of the screen lighting his face as twilight set in. A slow exhale escaped his lips, part disbelief, part release. He looked back to the sky where his son still pointed. The emblem had been a simple design, a silver feather entwined with a baby's footprint. It had started as a symbol of remembrance, but now it flew, literally and figuratively, with every aircraft that carried its quiet promise. A reminder that compassion could be structural, that safety didn't need to be loud, that strength wasn't always in control, but sometimes in care. Damien slipped his phone away and wrapped his arm around Eli. When compassion becomes policy, healing finally takes flight. The bell rang once, clear, steady, and final. From the tower's glass-paneled interior, Damien Cross heard it echo across the field below. A training aircraft, its white body gleaming in the morning sun, rolled slowly toward the runway. Its tail bore the insignia of the Eli Foundation, a silver feather wrapped around a baby's footprint. Damien stood silently in the tower, arms crossed, his gaze locked on the plane. His posture was calm, but his eyes moved with precise calculation, tracking every checklist, every wheel rotation, every flicker of the wing light. This wasn't just another takeoff. It was a test, a symbol, of everything that had taken flight since that day. Falcon Ridge Airfield had changed since then. The control tower's plaque now bore a new name etched in steel: Cross Field, in honor of integrity. And inside, the air buzzed not with bureaucracy, but purpose. Below, young cadets performed simulations, ones he had personally helped design. But it wasn't just about flight mechanics anymore. Their drills now included moral response scenarios, empathy tests under stress, and live-acted crisis restraint protocols. Behind Damien, the tower door creaked open. "I still can't believe we're teaching ethics in a flight academy," said a warm voice. Damien turned, a slight smile forming. "Captain Brandt," he said with quiet fondness. The retired pilot stepped beside him, his silver hair gently stirred by the breeze leaking through a cracked window. Brandt carried himself with less stiffness than before, his coat unbuttoned, his hands tucked behind his back like a grandfather surveying a garden. "Remember when we almost lost control of that Solaire over the Rockies?" Brandt chuckled. "Now, look at this." He gestured toward the plane inching down the runway, piloted by two trainees barely out of high school. Damien's smile faded into something more serious, thoughtful. We had to start somewhere. Their shared silence stretched into the vast horizon beyond the glass. Below, the plane lifted smoothly, its shadow rippling across the grass. The sight stirred something in Damien's chest. He took a slow breath, not of relief, but of reverence. From the corner of the room, footsteps pattered lightly. "Papa." Damien turned to see his son, now 8 years old, standing near the viewing platform's edge. Eli wore a small bomber jacket 2 sizes too big and a pair of dark jeans scuffed at the knees. His eyes, still wide with the wonder of childhood, were locked onto the plane, disappearing into the sky. He raised his hand in a clumsy salute. "Will I fly one day, Papa?" he asked, his voice innocent but steady. Damien knelt beside him, one knee clicking from old injuries, his face softening as he rested a hand on Eli's back. "Yes," he said, voice catching slightly, "but not just to fly." To protect what others forget, Eli looked up, puzzled but content, and nodded as if he understood enough for now. The engine's distant roar faded, and the air grew quiet again. Then a gentle gust of wind swept through the cracked window and lifted the edge of Damien's coat. He stood, eyes scanning the open skies beyond the control tower, and whispered, half to himself, half to the future that lay ahead. "The sky remembers." And just like that, the world moved forward. A single flight, a single child, a single promise, etched not in thunder, but in the wind's quiet memory. Justice may not come fast, but when it does, it flies true. He tried to quiet a baby and ended up quieted by the father who took command of the entire flight. If you believe strength protects, not harms, subscribe now, because justice always lands safely. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, cruelty, and the strength of a parent's love when faced with injustice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every human being, no matter how small.